Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to tonight's program, Michigan, My Michigan 4. This will be Lynn Houghton's final talk about the development of Michigan after World War II. And I'm glad to see so many people who have come out tonight. We have not been doing a lot of programming in the building for about a year and a half, so it's nice to actually commingle with the great people of Kalamazoo tonight. And also, we have some viewers through our Facebook and YouTube accounts. We'll be live streaming tonight's program with Lynn. So to those people, I say welcome as well. And if you have a question, you can type those into either YouTube or Facebook. And near the end of the program, we will try and ask Lynn what those questions are and see if we can get an answer out of her. So tonight's presenter is Lynn Houghton, and she currently serves as the Regional History Curator at WMU's Zhang Legacy Collection Center. In addition to having previously worked as a librarian at the Kalamazoo Public Library, Lynn is an accomplished author of many articles about Michigan and Kalamazoo history. Her work can be found in such local publications as Encore Magazine. She has co-authored the incredibly popular book, Kalamazoo Lost and Found with Pam O'Connor. Lynn has partnered with Gazelle Sports in developing the Historic Walks program. So many of you probably before the pandemic saw her walking around with her portable microphone, talking about the differences between Queen Anne's and Italianate architecture. In 2018, she appeared in the PBS series 10 That Changed America, where she spoke about the significance of the development of the Kalamazoo Mall. You can find many of her past talks about local history on the Kalamazoo Public Library's YouTube channel. And she was also the 2016 Kalamazoo YWCA Women of Achievement Award recipient. So without further ado, I know she's got a lot of ground, about 50, 60 years to cover. Please welcome Lynn Houghton.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you, in the idea of making my presentation a little bit clearer to hear, if you are comfortable with me removing my mask. Okay, fine. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here this evening. It seems like over this month and next month, I'm doing talks that I was supposed to do before the pandemic hit. And so this was one that I was scheduled to do in May of 2020. And so I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank Ryan Gage for asking me. We've been through a lot of changes in a lot of different areas. And one of the nice changes that has happened here at the public library is Ryan Gage, who I worked with and have known for a while, is now the local history manager of the library, which has been, I think, Ryan, for about a year now, isn't it? Or a little over, yeah, over a year. Over a year. So I'm really happy to work with him on this. As he said, the previous programs that I did in this series, you can find on the Kalamazoo Public Library's website and their YouTube channel. So if you missed any of the ones that I've done previously, please go back and look at them, and you can see my changing hairstyles, so you can pretty well date it, by that. But I really want to put out a shout out and kudos to the public library, the Kalamazoo Public Library, for what they have done with their website and the information that they put on it. And there are a lot of different videos, although it is really interesting when they have videos on there from you maybe 30 years ago. And when you were pregnant for your daughter, and during the series, you can see yourself glowing. That was an interesting experience. People ask me, "Are you pregnant now?" It's like, no, not that was back then. But that's been really nice, and it's really exciting, the plans that they have for the future, including Ryan graciously mentioned Kalamazoo Lost and Found. And that book, along with Peter Schmidt's book, 19th Century Homes in a Midwestern Village, and Walking Through Time, have been digitized and are going to be available to people through the courtesy of the Kalamazoo Public Library. So you'll be able to have it at your fingertips if you want to look for it. Yes, I do miss the Gazelle Sports Historic Walks. I miss not having them last year or this year, but we were doing this, of course, because of safety. And I am crossing my fingers that 2022 we'll be able to bring them back, and really, really excited about that. So without further ado, let's get into what we're going to be talking about this evening. So as I mentioned, this is, as you can see here, the fourth part of a series that I had been giving as a result of having taught Michigan history for about 15 years for Western Michigan University. And when that finished, you didn't just want that information to sit there. You want to do something about it. And so I developed 4 parts that look at Michigan history. Some of you may have attended some of the sessions that we had here. Each of the first 3 parts were 3 parts each. The first part dealt with the first peoples of Michigan to the beginning of the Civil War. The second part dealt with the Civil War through the Progressive Era. And the third part was with the automobile through World War II. So, when it comes to this section, which is post-World War II, there's not going to be 3 parts. Because in a lot of cases, the information is not there as much as what we have seen previously. And also, we're living it right now. So in the past, where one of the sessions may have spanned 200 to 300 years, we're dealing with 60, 70, 80 years we're looking at. But what a change has happened in Michigan during that time period. So why don't we begin? One of the things we will see with this session is the role that the federal government has played. The topics that we're going to deal with are very similar to the topics that I've dealt with in previous sessions, where we're looking at the economy and we're looking at the people, we're looking at cities. But there's going to be, one of the things I think we'll notice tonight is just the quick change that happens, how quickly things happen. Whereas before, things might have gone maybe 20, 30, 40-year time period for things to happen. Here, they're happening fast. So where am I going to? There we go. Oh, I usually have a challenge. The PowerPoint pointer, however you want to say it, at KPL, had always hated me, but they've got a new one. So this one likes me so far, so I shouldn't jinx it at all. So where do you find information out about this time period? This is a real challenge. One of the places you look at are some of the more traditional Michigan history textbooks. But when you get to that period after 1950, it's a little challenging to find the information that you're looking for. And what you find varies according to the publication time period. So for example, let's go back. So for example, the book in the upper left-hand corner, Michigan in 4 Centuries by F. Clever Bald, this was published in 1961. So it'll talk about we'll talk about the 50s, but doesn't really go all that far. In the lower, you have Michigan, A History of the Wolverine State, originally written by Willis Dunbar of Kalamazoo, later co-authored by George May. He did a later edition. When you get to that time period, not that much. Maybe a little bit into the 1990s when Dr. May became involved. The last textbook I used was the one by Roger Rosentreater in the upper, the one in the middle. That one came out in 2014. Now, he ventures a little bit into this time period that we're going to look at. And he does pretty well with the 50s and the 60s, but then after that, he does the who's who of Michigan at the time. So it really doesn't give that much information. Same thing with Michigan, A History of the Great Lakes State by Rubenstein and Ziowitz. That's very, very short. The one I really like is not really a textbook, but a new one that came out about 3 years ago called The Great Water, and that one has a lot of great primary resources, which I love to use. What's nice about this book, 2018, it goes as far as the Flint water crisis. So it is including things. Now, what might be a challenge? It's a word that I use over and over again, context. So many of the things that we're talking about now, we're still assessing them to still see the importance of what's going on with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple different areas of Michigan to, if anything, illustrate how things have changed. And we're going to get that all done in the time that we have to get done. Well, let's start off with this. And this is actually just to set the mood. This is an aerial view of Kalamazoo about that time period. And when you see, you can, well, this road right here going up, that's Michigan Avenue. So with that in mind, you might be able to tell some of the buildings that are around there. For example, have laser pointer travels. Okay, so here's Michigan Avenue, American National Bank, that's easy to see. Bronson Park, you can tell the season of the year. Congregational Church, here's First Reformed, First Baptist. So some of the buildings you might recognize, some of them you may not. But it gives you, this is about the time period that we're looking at. I could look at this photo for a very long time and pick out all the different buildings, but we're not going to look at this for the next half an hour. This is just to set our mood. Let's first look at the economy at this time period and the changes that it went through. One of the things that we do see overall is a growth of manufacturing. And I'm going to be throwing in some statistics from Kalamazoo to sort of illustrate that. For example, between 1940 and 1950, manufacturing in Kalamazoo grew by 81%. That's incredible, because we had manufacturing beforehand. But a combination due to the impact of World War II and the general growth just made it keep moving. Many companies did grow internationally. Now, some had already had a foothold in the international market, Upjohn being one of them, Kellogg's being another one. But more companies became involved in something like that. There were definitely new markets. They were getting into new products. In some cases, we'll see some of these companies begin to consolidate. And the other thing that we see, which is big, is right here. Now, when I say mass media, keep in mind what the mass media was at that time. Radio, yes. Magazines, yes. But definitely television and the impact that television had. This is the Shakespeare Company. This is December of 1925. We still have women working. Now, not as in great numbers as what it was previous to during World War II. There were so many women that were working in manufacturing. But still, and you know, Shakespeare, which primarily made sporting equipment and fishing rods, they're going to see an upsurge in sales because people are going to have time to do that type of thing. They're going to have more leisure time. Another thing we see even more, I love this photo. This is actually from 1925, but it's a good mood-setting photograph. This is the Bryan paper mill over on the south side. And you can see the paper mill right around here. I still don't have the position of this. I have looked at this photo for a long time. I haven't quite got it down as far as that. But we had a growth of paper in the teens and the 20s. Much more in the 40s. What we're seeing in the 40s with the paper mills in Kalamazoo is a lot of mergers and a lot of outside companies coming in to purchase them. But still, it is a predominant industry here in Southwest Michigan. And of course, the Upjohn Company. This is Building 41, which certainly got a lot of publicity over the last year because of what Pfizer has done there with the vaccination. When you look at the growth of Upjohn, before the war, they were located primarily in the downtown area as far as manufacturing goes. But as we get into the 50s, now they're moving into what was then Portage Township and continuing to grow even more out there. But let's not forget agriculture. In Michigan, like in a lot of states in the 19th century, agriculture was one of the prime industries. It still continued into the 20th century, but not as much as what it was before. Celery remained a big product in Kalamazoo, probably for another maybe 10 years, possibly. And this is a small family celery farm around the early 1950s. But when you're looking at manufacturing in Michigan, the predominance of the auto industry cannot be ignored. Couple things that we see after 1945. Well, one of the things is new civilians are now able to buy cars because during World War II, a civilian, unless you were an essential worker like a dentist or doctor, you could not buy a car. So now that's open to people. And people, having waited for 4 years, were ready. So by 1946, 2 million cars were sold in the United States. By 1949, 5 million. We see changes in administration. Right here we have a picture of Henry Ford, founder of the Ford Motor Company, and his son Henry II. So we see some changes happening as far as who are managing these companies. At this time, Ford was still number 3 behind General Motors and Chrysler, but things will change. We're also seeing new companies continue. Hudson Company, Packard, Kaiser Frazer, which made the Jeep, they're still going on, but eventually we had another company that started around 1954. I don't know how many of you remember the American Motors Company. They made models such as, now this was the merger of a couple of those smaller companies. They were headquartered in the Detroit area. Eventually they moved to Southfield. But they made cars like the Rambler, the Gremlin, the Pacer, the Javelin, and they had taken over the Jeep, manufacturing of the Jeep. Now, one of the things that we also see too here is, maybe foreign cars, they were coming, but not in great numbers. You've got the Volkswagen that is coming in at this time period, but it's not really going to be a major factor. People are buying them, but not like what happened many years later. Again, let's look at Kalamazoo County, and you can see the statistics of the numbers of registered cars. So a little more growth, 10 years in 1950, but look at the difference between 1950 and 1956. So the ownership is beginning to increase even more. And the advertising. This really was the era of the automobile. And you're looking at, for example, ads that talk about Fords. And I mentioned the thing about using the mass media. There was a commercial that I had on that you can find a lot of these commercials from that time period on YouTube. And there's one that I found from Ford that's real interesting because it's a pitch to become a 2-car family. And that was probably in the early 50s that they were convincing you that it was going to be so nice because the woman now had a car and she could do what she As a result of this, a lot of the benefits that auto workers and other workers enjoyed for a number of years. When you talk about unions, though, you have to talk about, at this point in time, this gentleman right here, Walter Ruther. Walter Ruther came to Detroit with his brother to work in the auto industry. He later made it through the unions, eventually becoming president of the UAW, and was president for 24 years, from 1946 until 1970. Now, Ruther had a big impact in what unions did, because it wasn't just protecting their workers and coming up with benefits for their workers, which a lot of unions did. But what Ruther did was he got the union, he himself got involved, and he got the union involved in national and state politics. Specifically, they aligned themselves with the Democratic Party. And so what you have here are some images. Here is Walter Ruther right here, marching with Martin Luther King Jr. when he was in Detroit, Michigan. And in the upper right-hand corner, you have Walter Ruther, again with Martin Luther King Jr., at the March on Washington in 1963. And in the lower photograph here, you have Walter Ruther with Cesar Chavez later on. So Ruther got the union involved in campaigning for much wider issues than just for the union, because this was going to impact the union also. So they got involved in issues related to civil rights, Medicare, healthcare, Medicaid, and voting rights. So Ruther was really a different type of person. In fact, so many people wrote about that he viewed unionism not just one way, but in a much broader way as uplifting the community within society. So the UAW did play a prominent role in many of those issues that we talked about. Another individual with the UAW that's interesting is Mildred Jeffrey, who was up in the upper right-hand corner. She was known for her, she was with UAW, she was the first female director. She directed Women's Bureau for many years. And she also was involved with labor rights, education, healthcare, civil rights, and women's rights. Especially at this time when they were looking for the Equal Rights Amendment and other issues that affected women. So the unions play a very big role in politics and in other ways, and especially in Michigan politics. Now, we do see changes in the auto industry, and that's going to impact Michigan, and that's going to impact their economy. Automation. The way of putting a car together advanced to the point that you weren't going to need as many people to assemble it. So by 1953, there were 900,000 workers in the United States making about 6.17 million cars. Within 7 years later, it had dropped about 100,000 people to make 6.7. Now, I know that seems a little, that doesn't really seem that much of a difference, but that number kept going down. And what that's going to impact is unemployment. People being able to find things if they're no longer working in the auto industry. We did have a number of recessions, economic recessions that made the sale of cars difficult. And whenever you have a recession and people don't buy cars, because Michigan's economy was so tied into this, it's going to have an impact on the economy of the state. A lot of factories were moving out of state, out of Michigan into other states, because for practical reasons, it made more sense. For the people in California, it made more sense to the auto industry to have a plant in California, because then you didn't have to really get involved with transportation costs that much. So in 1930, Michigan had 60% of all automotive employment. By 1958, it was 47%. So it was beginning to decline, and that is going to have an impact on a lot of things in Michigan, especially the economy, as we're moving along here in the 1950s. I'm not going to ask you how many of you might remember the oil embargo in the 1970s. And whenever I taught Michigan history, the students would always laugh when I told them that the price of gas increased 350%. Okay, so that's the spot where you go, wow, 350%. But then you tell them it increased from 42 cents to $1.30, which I always get chuckles out of that until I tell them, let's think about what people were making at the time, the difference that $1.30 was at that point in time. And, there were cars lined up for blocks to try to get gas. What this was doing was it was increasing the appeal of more foreign competitors. So you would begin to see more ads like this. Now, is it that much of a difference? No, by 1975 it was about 18% of the market, but it was growing. And 85% of those cars came from Japan. So Japan is getting a little bit of a tiny foothold into it. So we're also dealing with the auto industry, and this is all affecting Michigan. It's dealing with federal regulations. Ralph Nader
safety performance, emissions, fuel economy measures. I'm trying to figure out how this book went from $5.99 to $1. So I don't know how that did. But this was Mr. Nader's first big book talking about the prayer. And as he said, unsafe at any speed. That's going to affect the cost of the car if you're having to implement many of those things. Later on, we're beginning to see a lot of things, mergers. We see a lot of plants that are being closed. We see lines that are no longer being made. This is a photo in the lower right-hand side of the last Oldsmobile that came online. You know, for General Motors, it was that 5 Cadillac, Chevrolet, Buick, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile. Things changed when they stopped making Pontiacs and Oldsmobiles. Oldsmobiles they stopped in 2004. And we also see, too, the numbers of auto industries that, well, not the number, we had Chrysler, we had GM that went bankrupt, and how things affected that, per se. So the auto industry. So let's see what was going on in the government at the time and what kind of impact did things like the changing economy have on it. Our population boomed, and I'll use 2 words to give an explanation for that real quickly. The baby boom. Soldiers were coming home, they were getting married, they were having babies, and now that was certainly not the only reason. But when you look at the growth in Michigan, you can see the difference between 1940 and 1960. Politically, the most predominant person was this gentleman on the left, Ned Williams, who was elected governor. He had put together a consortium of groups that strengthened the Democratic Party, including individuals and labor and liberals. And what is, you'll see that this article, you don't have to read the whole thing. I will consolidate it for you and tell you basically what it was talking about was the power of the unions in Michigan. And it was an article, this is just a short part of it, but it was not very complimentary about the relationship between labor and the state, and the perception that labor was really running the state of Michigan. He was elected governor 6 times between 1948 and 1960, but at that time, the term of the governor was just 2 years. It wasn't the 4 years that we're dealing with right now. He did have a very ambitious agenda. When you have that many people, you know what the demand is in one area is the demand is going to be, and that's education. These kids are being born and they're going to need to go to school, among other things. And he also had ideas that he wanted to do with other things, and healthcare and civil rights, but you need money for that. And when you look at things that were overwhelmingly issues that Michigan dealt with for a long time, and in some cases, when you're thinking about it, in some cases we're still dealing, maybe not with the bottom portion, but we're still talking about funding services. How do you fund those services? So let's get the one off that, for some people, they really find apportionment exciting. For others, it may not be all that much that makes them want to cheer. But it is interesting, and we're dealing with it right now when you're looking at the districts that are being remapped, and when you're looking at every 10 years that happening as a result of the census. So we are living that right now. What they were living with in Michigan was the unequal nature of the way that things were happening. A lot of that was because of population. When you look at something like this, the difference between Old County and Copper County up in the Upper Peninsula, the difference in population, but the same number of state senators from that area. And that's just a short illustration of what exactly happened with what was going on. And so, for years, Michigan struggled with this. And you're looking at either going one way. Do you base it on population? Do you draw your districts up according to population? Or do you draw your districts up according to geography? So what do you do?
Okay, we're going to put that
off to the side.
because they struggled with this for years. And it wasn't until later that they actually came up with, well, a solution was brought up for them.
But let's get back to money.
During
During the Great Depression, the state of Michigan had instituted a sales tax of 3%.
And
It was huge back in 1933 to fund services. But now, 20 years later, that was still their main source of income. And there were amendments passed by the state that would divvy up that sales tax. So when you looked at the last amendment in 1952, yes, a great majority of it goes to schools, smaller goes to local government, and only 20% went to state government. And so you're having to fund all the services that the state has to fund with 20% of the sales tax. So that was one thing. And, not only do we have the growth in schools, they have other social programs they want to go to. And this was something that the governor and the legislature wrestled with for a long time, and not really coming up to any kind of solution. Meanwhile, the state's going into debt. And by 1961, we had a deficit of $100 million, which doesn't sound much today, but think about what that might have been back then. That was a lot. And we got a lot of press, not all very positive as far as what that was going to go. So I don't want to say all bad things about what was happening. Let's look at some other things that were happening at that time. Oh, yeah, we had a little bridge that was built at this point. It's interesting when you look at this because the attempts to span the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula, they have been thinking about this for a long time. They even started thinking about it after the Brooklyn Bridge was dedicated in New York in the early 1880s. I don't think that would really work here, up in that area. Horatio Earl, who was a very interesting individual, was very big on good roads and was the first head of the Department of Transportation, had a plan, and it was really interesting when you would see the plan. His idea was not to build a span in this location. His idea was to build a series of bridges that would go from island to island. So whether or not you go from Round Island, now you also had to go to Mackinac Island. I don't think that would have really flown at all. But that didn't go. The State Ferry Service started in 1923, and they began to look at studies around that time period about the bridge. But if you've seen pictures of the State Ferry Service, you know how many cars would line up at certain times of the year, especially during hunting season, to get on. My great uncle actually ran one of the boats, and I give credit to my great aunt. Because what she would do is, when she got done with work, she'd go home and make as many sandwiches as she could to sell to the individuals that were waiting in their cars to get onto the ferry. But I think there was a realization that they needed to do something. They had actually started planning it during World War, before World War II. In fact, my father, my grandmother's family is from the St. Louis area, so my father went up there a lot. He was telling me many years before he passed away about attempts before the war to actually start something. But it didn't really go anywhere. This was something that the governor really promoted because he thought it would be good for the economy of the peninsula and tourism. People have more cars, people might get up to the Upper Peninsula to go to the mystery spot. Of course, everybody goes to the mystery spot. And you remember the mystery spot. I actually saw a billboard for this summer and I thought, oh my gosh. I remember that the mystery spot and the seashell city that is still there. It's like, well, things haven't changed all that much, haven't they? Oh, they have a lot. So the Mackinac Bridge Authority was formed around 1950. They authorized bonds that were going to be paid off by tolls. It was completed in 1957, and at that time it was the largest suspension bridge in the world. The bonds were paid off by the mid-1980s, but for those of you that have crossed the bridge recently, you know that you still pay a toll. One of the reasons for that is because I-75 technically doesn't, well, you can say that I-75 keeps going over the bridge, but they don't consider it that way because
if it was I-75, they would have to follow different rules and regulations for fixing this area. I think they'd like to have a little bit of a liberty
to do what they need to do properly on the bridge. Walking across the bridge is nice. I don't know if I would have really appreciated what they're doing now, but I know they had to change it so that you only can walk halfway and walk back. But it still is quite a thrill if you haven't done it. I think it's really, really good. So we did the National Bridge squeezed it, but we were still having problems with money and with apportionment. Michigan previously had 3 different constitutions, and they were ready to write a 4th. The picture of the individual in the corner may look familiar. This is George Romney, Mitt Romney's father. And George Romney came to Michigan to head the American Motors Corporation. And he was one of the leaders of the Constitutional Convention, or the CONCON, as it was known. And two of the biggest issues that they did want to wrestle with was the funding and the apportionment issue. How would you divide Michigan up? So they had a large group of delegates. It was really notable that this was the first time that both women and African Americans had been included in the convention delegates for this. There was a vote to approve it, and they began work in 1961 and completed it in 1962, the work of it, and then it went to approval of the voters. And so sometimes read this as being either the Constitution of 1963, or sometimes they say 1964, but this is the current Constitution that we are ruled under, with a whole lot of amendments put up to it. So let's look at what was instituted in this Constitution. We're going to do it very briefly, like what we've done previously. Previous to this, the governor and the lieutenant governor were elected separately. As a result of this Constitution, they would now be a team. Of course, we would still be voting for Secretary of State and Attorney General, and if you've been looking at the news, you can see that things are already getting set for the election in 2022 in the state. One of the things they also did is they created boards for universities which were run by the State Board of Education at the time. So the symbols that I have on the screen: Western Michigan University, East Northern Michigan, Central Michigan, and Eastern Michigan. They now had separate boards. Now, as opposed to Wayne State, Michigan State, and the University of Michigan, these would not be elected by the voters. They would be appointed by the governor. They consolidated departments, tried to streamline government, which they usually do during these constitutions. But there were some other things that they did. Remember I told you they were going to deal with funding? So what they didn't actually institute a flat rate income tax, but they put the wording in there that the legislature could do it if they wanted to. And that actually came later, not through this Constitution, but it was instituted maybe about a year, 2 years later. And keep in mind, you see, it's a flat rate, not a graduated, like what we have with the federal government. One of the things that you will hear mentioned, and I think this was as a result of all that debt that we had incurred, the deficit that we had, that balanced budget. And whenever the state works on the budget, you will hear them say it's balanced, or they'll say that they no more deficit spending, no more deficit spending that they said. Different judicial changes, different boards that were created. Cities already had home rule. What home rule refers to is that the cities and counties would be given the right to determine things like how they were governed, other things that they could do. Now, when it came to apportionment, they decided in the Constitution that they wanted it based both on geography and people, on population. Eventually, that was ruled unconstitutional, and what we have in Michigan is both the State House and the State Senate are according to population. So that's how things are apportioned. They did create a Civil Rights Commission, which is still in operation as a bipartisan Civil Rights Commission.
Michigan was one of the first states in the country to constitutionally create this commission. And it was very similar to, I mean, they put in the Constitution that this commission would not be eliminated, as they did in our first Constitution, where they had created a superintendent of instruction who would be in charge of the schools, and that wouldn't be eliminated either. All right, so state government. So they're dealing with those issues that we talked about, with funding and apportionment, and a few other things too. All right. Let's look at education. Well, I think I've already alluded to the fact that due to the growth in state population and the baby boom, schools are exploding with students. I like to use this. I only use this whenever I do this. The statistic in my first grade class. I had 61 students in my classroom when I was first grade. Sister Noel ran a very tight ship. So we got a lot of holy cards. Yes, I was in Catholic school. But I don't know how typical that was at other schools. The other first grade had 56 students. I don't know. But you were dealing with schools that had a very, very high population. And so when you look at statistics, the difference between the state population and the population in the school age itself. So they were going to have to deal with that. And this is actually a classroom in Winchell. Actually in the probably the early 60s. And they're getting ready for a field trip. So that's why the mothers are behind there. So they're going to have a field trip. But a little bit more crowded than what we have these days as far as education goes. Well, one of the things education-wise that we did in Michigan with school districts is the area of consolidation. Because of all the things that they had to provide to them, a lot of districts decide, and because of what the state required, they decided to consolidate so that they could give the services that they needed. So when you look at the number of school districts, which is what that number is down the bottom, big difference between 1910 and 1960. I have an individual who taught in the history department at Western, and he grew up in Bangor, Michigan. And he talked about the difference that consolidation made for him and the opportunities that it provided for him. One of the things he talked about was busers, which they would not have had they stayed in their smaller school district. The other thing that we have now in 2020, we had 587 districts. I don't know if that's the same thing or not, but a big difference from what there was at the beginning of the 20th century. The growth was not only in elementary school and high school, but in colleges. Brought about by the GI Bill, which allowed veterans, it was technically called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. So you had a huge growth in construction. There is an architectural firm in Detroit, it was called the Calder Architectural Firm. He must have gotten a contract for just about every building on every university campus in Michigan. And it's incredible. They were exceedingly busy during the 40s and 50s. Due to World War II and the excess amount of buildings that were available for people, you saw more of the use of, for example, the Quonset huts that would be used as classroom buildings or residential buildings. The one on the right is Michigan State University. So a lot of changes here. Again, in my way of including photos from Kalamazoo, it would be behoove me if I did not include some images from Western. The picture in the upper left-hand corner is I'm not sure if it's science, but this is a photograph of Cracken Hall, which is no longer there. The lower is a dorm room. I'm guessing it's either Draper Siege Log or the Burnhams, and I have to say that 30 years later, the room looked about the same, having lived in the Burnhams when I first came to Western. And the photo on the right, when you're dealing with Western, is one that is many people's favorites.
And it shows the growth of where you still had buildings off Oakland Drive and what was East Campus. But then you were beginning to have a jump over Stadium Drive to what was known as West Campus, and later was known as, now it's considered Main Campus. I just threw in a lot of other pictures to show. Now this was what was known as Trailer Village. And it was located where Reed Fieldhouse, or the University Fieldhouse is located, and the Student Recreation Center. And those were buildings that were brought in to provide housing for the veterans that were coming with their families. And so that existed for a number of years. But you can see the growth of dorms and other buildings across Western Campus, fueled by what was going on with the population boom and the demand for education. One of the things we also saw were a number of community colleges that are being started at this time. I've got a picture of KCCC, Kalamazoo Valley Community College to the left. To the right, I have a picture of my alma mater, which is now known as Grand Rapids Community College, but when I was there, it was called Grand Rapids Junior College. Now, Grand Rapids Junior College actually got started in 1914, so it was one of the oldest it was vocational and technical courses, but because state aid is beginning at the end of World War II, we now see growth. There are now 39 in the state of Michigan. And about 30 years ago, about 40% of college students are in community colleges. I'm not sure what that is now. And what's also been interesting for me to see and for me to experience are the programs that I've seen grow at community colleges and also the outreach they have to high schoolers in the area and some of the programs that they have available. Not just at community colleges, but the universities and other colleges. For example, dual enrollment, where high school students can take college classes. KVCC, I'm sure that they're not the only ones that started the program called the Middle College, where high school juniors that qualify can begin to take classes at KVCC, stay 1 year past their high school graduation, and have an associate's degree. So they've been doing a lot over the years to give students a wide variety of courses and other opportunities to get an education. The other thing I forgot to mention when we talked about the growth of colleges and universities are the additional ones that began after in the 50s and 60s. Saginaw Valley, Lake Superior State, branches of the University of Michigan and MSU, and of course Grand Valley State University to the north. So a lot of things in education. The other thing we see happening at this time were things that might put the fear into students, assessment tests, whether it was the MEET or the M-STEP, and the increased importance of those. We also see, too, the need for racial balance. We did have segregated schools, even into this time period, caused primarily because of where people of color were living and where people of color could only live. There certainly has been, when I talked about the changes that have happened in the last year and a half, there seems to have been, and I think this was even previous to this, more awareness of the term redlining and what that meant in many communities in the north, including communities like Kalamazoo. So first, well, in many communities, in many cities at this time, for example, in Detroit became a largely segregated school system. And you can see there, by 1970, there were 63% of the population were people of color. They did have a plan for desegregation, and the plan included desegregating Detroit with about 53 suburban districts, which would mean busing close to about 800,000 students. Now, when I say Milligan v. Bradley, that was the name of the case that made all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the ruling at that point in time in 1974 said that whatever segregation Detroit was experiencing in education needed to be solved within their city boundaries. So cross-district, cross-community desegregation through education and through busing did not happen. Kalamazoo, though, it did. There was a study in 1969 that showed that 90% of students of color went to school on the north side. And so it led to a series of actions and a court case that ordered busing, which we had started in 1972, to achieve racial balance. And that existed for a number of years. So I think that there still are steps that are being taken to try to make the schools more racially diverse. And this is something that we are still dealing with to this day. Financing education, again, a struggle. You had the flat rate income tax that came on board, but what else are you going to do? Well, property taxes are one thing. And then another thing that happened around 1972, the start of the lottery. Now, there's always been a little interest because there's always been people saying, well, all the money is going to go to education. And in some cases it was interesting that when this started, I actually found an image of a ticket from 1972. How I don't know. But it was only, it took about 9 years that profits would go to the school aid fund from the lottery. And then what you saw happen is the legislature might cut the general fund. What they do say is that 27 cents on every dollar goes to the school aid fund. Now that was stated in 2019, and at that point they said that that amounted to about $1 billion in the school aid fund. The other thing, of course, you've got local districts that raise money through property taxes. And then in 1994, you had Proposal A. And Proposal A stated that property taxes would be cut and that they would increase the sales tax. Now, at that point in time, our sales tax was 4%. And it increased it to 6%. And then it would say that each district would get a similar rate from the state. So that's the financing that we are dealing with right now. Now, one of the things that we have seen in the public schools are various alternatives, and these are alternatives that we are seeing in Kalamazoo. The start of magnet schools, when Lincoln became international, the Lincoln School for International Studies. And now we have a series of both elementary and we have middle schools that are also magnet schools that have different themes. Charter schools. Paramount as one example of it. Oakland Academy. We've got several other charter schools out there. And the whole notion of schools of choice. And you will see that advertised by different districts, telling people that they would have openings in certain districts, whether it be Augusta or Gull Lake, if people would like to leave their district and move into another one. So different ways that people, that children can go to different schools. We've also seen, too, in the last year and a half, the changes in education when it came to the virtual school. We had virtual school, but certainly not to the level that we had between 2020 and 2021. And I think we will continue to see education morph and change, especially integrating the hybrid, the virtual school, different things like that. Okay, education. Let's look at where people live. We looked at where people work. We looked at where people went to school. So let's look at the different changes as far as where we were living at the time. There's a statistic that I used in Michigan history to illustrate a couple different things. And it used the date 1890 and 1920. So in 1890, the majority of the people in Michigan lived in the rural setting. They lived on farms, they lived in small communities. In 30 years, by 1920, there were more people living in urban areas than rural. Industry, jobs, economy, other reasons that may have done that. What we're going to see now is another shift. The shift from the cities to the suburbs. Now, many of these communities already began before 1950, but the growth was even further. So yes, there was a perception of a lot of different things. The environment. The houses could be, inexpensive. When you're looking at the cost of housing, then you get into another factor that had an impact on where people lived, and that was where they could get financing for these houses. And a lot of times, people got financing through the Federal Housing Administration, a program that was started during the New Deal. In fact, between 1930 and 1950, 3 out of 5 houses, now I'm talking nationally, 3 out of 5 houses were financed by the Federal Housing Administration. Unfortunately, it was very hard for people of color to get financing through the FHA. One of the reasons we have here, we'll get back to that, one of the things we have here is we talked about the factories that were moving to the suburbs. That was a factor in people moving. And another reason was transportation. We'll get into transportation in a little more detail. But transportation also impacts where people live if you can afford a car. Because so many of these areas are not going to have urban transportation. Maybe in some of the larger cities, but a lot of the cities are not going to have a bus system that's going to go from the suburbs into the cities, so transportation is hard. But let's get back to affordable housing, inexpensive housing. One of the things that the FHA did is they rated and evaluated loan risks based on the housing. And if you were in a new housing development, then your chances of getting an FHA loan were fairly good. If you were in a neighborhood that was older, in a city, where there were maybe a predominance of people of color and other individuals, your chances of getting an FHA loan was a little bit harder. So, and it was easier to get a loan for a new house than if you lived in an older house. So it was a very complicated kind of thing. You needed to put down a certain amount of money. So to just sort of encapsulate, there was inexpensive housing in the suburbs. There were some that could not reach that at this time period. So keep that in mind. As far as transportation goes, one of the things that you saw was not so much money, as I said, for public transit, but for roads. And one of the big programs that was passed at that time, huge program, was the Federal Highway Act of 1956. This was championed. Now, FDR was a firm supporter of the highway system, but World War II prevented anything from happening. But Dwight Eisenhower saw what went on in Germany, you may have heard this before, with the Autobahn system, and wanted to do the same thing here in the United States. And so the law was passed. The formal title of the bill is the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. Because keep in mind, in Germany, the Autobahn was a way that the military were able to get their equipment from point A to point B. Okay. So even though we know it as one term, it was also known as, I mentioned, Interstate and Defense Highways. Keep that in mind. So 45,000 miles. I don't even know how many miles, I can't even imagine how many miles are there at this date in the game. And there were uniform standards as far as how these roads would be built. And it was said that more than any single action by the government since the end of the war, this one would change the face of America. And there's no question about that. I have 2 photos here. When you look at Detroit was only second to Los Angeles in the miles of freeways that they built. On the left, is it on the left? No, it's on the right. On the left is the Lodge Freeway, and it was the first sunken freeway and sunken expressway. And then we've got let's see what I have. Oh yeah, the Lodge is on the left, Chrysler's on the right. When you look at Detroit, the impact, having the highway built is one thing, but the number of buildings that came down to make way for this highway was astronomical. So for example, with I-94, the Edsel Ford Highway, close to 5,000 homes and 400 businesses were taken down for that. With the Lodge, I'm sure it was very similar. We're hearing a little bit more about the construction of these expressways, especially with the Chrysler on the right, because I-75 cut through an area in Detroit called Paradise Valley, which was a predominantly African-American area that had started probably, I don't know specifically, I mean, there had been a community there anyway, but then the ethnicity, the racial mix of the individuals changed. And so by the turn of the 20th century, into the teens and the 20s, this was a huge, vibrant community with businesses owned by African Americans, businesses and churches and hospitals and doctors' offices and homes. And when this expressway was built, all those people were relocated. What has been interesting, and I heard a piece on the news recently by an individual living in Detroit whose father had to leave Paradise Valley. They lost their business, if I'm not mistaken. And what they would like, and talking about some sort of reparations for what happened there, what happened to that community. I think we're going to be hearing more about that. So you may be reading more about that, and you may be hearing more references to Paradise Valley in Detroit. I got to experience it a little bit. Now this is a really blurry picture, but this is the best I could do. I think I'm going to have to contact my friends in Grand Rapids to see if they can give me another one. I lived through the construction of I-196 that cut through my neighborhood in the west side of Grand Rapids. I saw houses being moved, I saw churches coming down, and I mean, the neighborhood survived, but it just wasn't the same when you had this huge concrete thing come through. But this is what, when you look at transportation, what we were doing at the time. Here are some more photos from our area. To the left, this is the Westminster Interchange, what it used to look like when it had that sort of like cloverleaf design. And the one on the right is Portage Street, and the one building that may look familiar is this one right here, which now, I think it's a grocery store and restaurant, Central Furniture. The Millwood shopping area would be around in this area, so this is Portage right here, and here's the expressway coming through. One of the more interesting cases, I have to give credit to my friend Steve Rossio at the Portage District Library for making me aware of this, is this blurry image. But what I'd like you to focus on is, here is I-94 going west. They have built the bridge over Westminch Avenue, and it stops. Because what happened was, there was a farmer right here that would not sell their land. And it actually did, they wanted more money. Now, how much money they wanted, I don't know. And it did go through the courts. And what the court ruled was, remember what I told you the original name of that act was? Defense. So what the court ruled is that they needed to acquire their property because of defense, for national defense. And that was settled around 1957. So just interesting things. And I'm sure that there were more of these cases that went around, but this I thought was really, really interesting. So thank you to my friend Steve for that. Remember I said that when they talked about that the highway, the National Highway Act changed our communities in more ways than we would want to know. And we could probably tick off all the ways that highways did. For example, shopping. Although as I stand here tonight, one of the changes that we've seen happen that I never thought would happen is what has been happening to regional malls. But what we have here is, to the left, you have a picture of Northland Mall, built in Southfield, which was one of the first regional shopping malls in the United States. began in 1954 in Southfield. It's gone, no longer exists. But to the right is Rogers Plaza, which is in Wyoming, Michigan, and that was created in 1961. Does not look like that. But think about the impact of that regional shopping malls had on where we shopped, where we ate, what we did. And this is another thing when you talk about changes. And the changes that I've seen in regional malls has not happened as a result of the pandemic. I think this is something that has happened through the years with the change in the way people are shopping and what they're getting. But when you look at our regional mall at Crossroads, I never thought I would see a day that there are so many empty storefronts there. Fascinating. Remember I told you how change is happening and sometimes change is happening quickly? But still, for a long period of time, for a good 50 years, this is where a lot of people wanted to go. You know, have an impact, the car and the expressway and other things would certainly have an impact on the way that we would shop. I threw this in again for atmosphere, but the auto bank, the Industrial State Bank, that was located on Portage across from the Washington Square Library. There is an old Co-America Bank there that is now the site of the first Churchill Prize scientist. So that was there many years ago. But of course to the right, we have a lot of these grocery stores called Myers that opened up and a lot of other things. You talk about malls. Here is an image of the opening of Southland, which is interesting when you look at how shopping in malls change. Southland is a perfect example because it starts off as more of what we described as a strip mall, then went more into an enclosed mall, and now is back to when you think of where Kohl's and Barnes & Noble are, so that same sort of concept. Absolutely fascinating. Also had an impact in where we eat. Now I had this photo anyway, and I had to throw it in because this, when I grew up, we didn't start eating at McDonald's. We ate at this one, which actually come back, I think was not just a local chain. I think they were around. But it was not far from my grandparents, and we could convince our grandparents to go there. My parents did not want to go there, but my grandparents did. So whenever we went to go visit them, we would go there. Some individual from Grand Rapids sent me this image when I had talked about it. The thing that amazes me are the numbers of garbage receptacles that are out there. They're being very optimistic and being very well prepared for things. When we look at shopping, when you talk about what our response was to the changes happening, there's no better example than the Kalamazoo Mall in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And the studies that they put into the despair they felt as, well, the one store that left was Sears, but when I think about it, Sears moved to Crosstown Parkway, which was probably maybe about a mile away, but still it was enough to motivate them to bring in Victor Gruen and design. They didn't do everything that Victor Gruen pulled together, but they did close off, in the end, four streets to make the mall. And so to the left, we have when they were constructing it. To the right, there's the opening day. I had these photos at my disposal, so I had to bring them out anyway. I love the one on the bottom. That was probably in the, I want to say the 70s, which totally amazes me because we had regional malls at that time, but you still had people coming downtown. So that was really very, very interesting. And we've seen changes in the Kalamazoo Mall. We've also seen in downtowns attempts to do things like convention centers. And so we received the Kalamazoo Center in the 1970s. So in a way to bring things, to bring people into the downtown area, which they still continue to do. Not another exciting thing to talk about, but I find it interesting, and that is the area of annexation, which is what we see during this time period. And cities that were losing tax base saw annexation as a way to grow it. And in some areas, there were areas that were more than happy to be annexed into a larger community because that might give them water, sewer, education. Grand Rapids, the city of Grand Rapids, during this time period doubled in size from 23 square miles to about 44 square miles due to annexation. Kalamazoo, we more than tripled in size because of annexation. And areas that we annexed included things like areas like Millwood, Oakwood, Knollwood, and other areas too. Of course, one of the things that happened is that some of these were challenged. In Grand Rapids, there was a court case that dealt with some property that previously had been the site of their airport before they moved to their current location. And of course, in Kalamazoo, you had I wish one of these days someone would write the true story about it, the story of Kalamazoo's attempt to annex Portage, certain sections of Portage and Kalamazoo townships due to the industrial base, and how they were beaten by Portage Township, which saw the creation of the city of Portage. I think that would be an absolute interesting, maybe not a movie, but podcast, whatever, I'm not really too sure. So, and in some cases, townships, they created a way in the late 1940s to protect themselves. So you see the numbers of townships in Michigan where you see the sign Kalamazoo Township, a charter township. Charter townships cannot be annexed. So they wanted to prevent what had happened in those cases. Cities were dealing with challenges, Detroit more than anybody else, but other urban cities were dealing with this. Detroit was losing population. They had a lot of changes due with demographics. We already mentioned the inability of people of color to be able to buy houses in the suburbs. They did not have good public transportation going to the different counties. Their population was changing. And one individual that tried to deal with it was the mayor at that time, Jerome Kavanaugh. And he was elected mayor in 1961 and took advantage of any program that was available through the Great Society program promoted by Lyndon Baines Johnson, passed by Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the War on Poverty. And so got funds available for a lot of different programs, for counseling, for education. They did get a very large share of the federal funds for programs like this. Only Chicago and New York received more federal money. And unfortunately, there were not funds available to deal with job discrimination, police brutality, deindustrialization. And so you saw things in Detroit, the riot of 1967. Detroit was not the only community in Michigan where this happened, but it was by far the largest and got a lot of publicity of what was going on. And so many issues that they dealt with in 1967 they are still dealing with today. Detroit, being our largest city, has been dealing with a lot over the years. Bankruptcy, which happened in 2013, but they did emerge a year later. And when you look at Detroit, they still face many, many issues. But they have gotten into some things which have been interesting, like urban farming, and there was a lot of publicity, a lot of programs and books and other things that talked about the urban farming. And there have been many books, many of which I have enjoyed, that and have learned a lot in talking about Detroit during this time period. So if I were to look at what are the numbers of books that deal with Michigan, I would say Detroit would probably be the more predominant topic. Environment. And when we look at the environment over the last, and dealing with the environment over the last 60 years, there has been a lot of attention to this day about air pollution, water pollution, the impact of industrialization. We're dealing with it now when you look at Kalamazoo and discussions of what has been going on at the north side and the impact of the industrialization over there. Michigan did do much in the area of conservation, but there still was a great deal of concern about the environment. There were general disasters that motivated people, like the Cuyahoga River in Ohio catching fire. And in Michigan, the response was, well, Earth Day. The first Earth Day in 1970, that whole thing was started by students at the University of Michigan. who had teach-ins in March, and in April of 1970 proposed for a national teach-in, thus the birth of Earth Day. And the button that you see in the lower left-hand corner was created on Ann Arbor's campus, and that was adopted nationally and worn by a number of people. I have to admit, I think I still have mine in my drawer somewhere from that time period. There was federal action on many of these acts. Unfortunately, I think some of them have been watered down a little bit. On the state level, we have the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Environmental Quality. There have been some things that have happened at this point in time. One of the things is when you look at the impact of our lake shores, and overall, yes, there were a lot of things created at that time. With Michigan, you had the beginnings of two jewels in our crown. When you look at, for example, the pictured rocks, which opened and began in 1966, 40 miles of coastline, and a lot of trails for those of you that hiked there with lots of insects, so you gotta be ready for that, especially black flies, but it's the time of the year that you do that. And one area that I am very intimately aware of is Sleeping Bear, the Sleeping Bear National Lakeshore, which began in 1970. They just finished, they're celebrating their 50th anniversary. I have to admit that the photo on the left and the photo on the right I took, but we spent a lot of time up at Sleeping Bear in the month of, for a week in August, so that's really nice. And the individual down below, Senator Phil Hart, was someone who was very critical in the creation of both of those national lake shores. Visitor Center is named after him, and I think there were a lot of people who were mad at him, but in the end, I think it was well worth it. So that. So the Great Lakes are a treasure, but unfortunately, we're dealing with issues, whether it is dumping, whether it is diversion from the Great Lakes, and I think they are always in danger. This is my shot of Lake Superior. One of the things we're dealing with, invasive species, all the time. I think this was interesting. I don't expect you to identify all of these, but this is titled Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System. And this is, they keep checking out the numbers. Now this was 184. It wasn't just fish and anything else, I mean living things, well of course it's all living, but it's also looking at plants and organisms and other things that have got into the Great Lakes as a result of, not solely, but when we have things like both the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Sault Ste. Marie, and over on the left-hand side you have a very early picture of the locks at the Sault and the impact that that has had on bringing these invasive species to Michigan. I have no idea what we're dealing with right now as far as invasive species. 184 was a number that came out in, I got in the beginning of 2020. I'm going to have to see, unfortunately, what we have these days. The issue of Asian carp. I haven't heard anything lately. I don't know if you've heard anything about Asian carp, but the concern that we had as far as what that was going to mean. We also deal with issues of water diversion, whether it be, now I know that there's a Great Lakes Compact between states and also two provinces of Canada, but there still are approval given to a lot of diversion from the Great Lakes. The one that's been interesting, Foxconn, that's the company that came to Wisconsin, and we're going to give all these jobs, and it hasn't really panned out, and they wanted to take out a huge amount. Wisconsin and Waukesha, they wanted to take out 8 million gallons a day, so we still have that issue that's happening. As far as the environment, there are many books that are dealing with this, and still many books that are coming out. I know that there was one of them, The Living Great Lakes, that, if I'm not mistaken, was one of the community reads here at the Kalamazoo Public Library, and Mr. Dennis has just come out with a new book on the Upper Peninsula, so there's even more that's coming out. Probably the one major environmental disaster that happened in Michigan at this time was PBB. And that was the episode in 1973 when a fire retardant was mixed with cattle feed, and as a result, resulted in, so the polybromide biofil, I totally mispronounced that and I apologize for that. But a number of cattle and chickens and swine and sheep were destroyed, but the other thing that's hard is that how many people still have this in their bodies, in their systems. It was estimated that when this was happening in the 1970s, that they estimated that 8.5 million residents in Michigan had consumed meat, milk, and eggs contaminated by PBB. And I think we're probably still dealing with that. There have been books, again, there were 2 big books written about the PBB, and also there are the area that is the Michigan Chemical Site, the company that created the PBB, and they've got it fenced off, but they do have things there to note it. One of the things that we've been hearing more about, we've been seeing this, the impact of PFAS. A couple years ago, we dealt with this in the city of Parchment, and the Forever Chemical. So the environmental issues are not changing, including when you're dealing with basic water. Now, when I took this picture, we were dealing with the issue of Flint. For those of you that have been listening to the news, know that they're dealing with the same issues in Benton Harbor. And currently they are using dollars from the COVID Recovery Act to replace all the lead service lines in Benton Harbor. But a lot of what they're saying sounds very familiar in Flint about inability to drink the water, the condition of the water. So we're still dealing, and we will continue to deal with issues that relate to Michigan's environment. When I started this series on Michigan history, one of the things we started with were the first peoples that came to the area, and with that, the numbers of, again, and then we got into the Native Americans that were here, and we got into some specific information about the people of the Three Fires. And this last session, I'm sort of ending with a reflection of a listing of the numbers of tribes that we have that are federally recognized. Currently, we have 12 in Michigan. Many of these do have gaming contracts with the federal government. If you just head up north, you see one up there near Hopkins, around in that area. Things have definitely changed for them in many ways, but certainly what has not changed for them is their role in the history of Michigan. It's ironical that I show you this one because I am a member of this tribe through my grandmother's family, and I must say I'm quite proud to be one because my grandmother was told not to be proud of it. So the generational challenge I find very, very interesting. The challenges that we face are not going to change. What we've seen, as I mentioned, in the last year and a half, that a lot of these changes have been amplified. And the way we deal with them will be interesting to see over the last few years, and in the upcoming year. Yes, we're still going to have issues related to climate. Yes, we're still having issues when it comes to racial inequality. We mentioned environmental injustice, health care. These are all things that not only people in Michigan are going to deal with, but people all over. But hopefully, by looking at where we've been, we can figure out where we want to go from there. So with that, that is the ending of this presentation. But I do want to give you some time to ask any questions that you would have at this point. Anybody have any questions? No questions that came in. That's fine. Well, anyway, I wanted to make sure, and if I was looking at my watch too much, I apologize for that. One of the things I want to mention, though, you see the artwork that's around the room. One of the changes that is happening, because I mentioned change, one of the changes that happened to the Archives and Regional History Collections is we are being joined by another department from the library called Rare Books and Special Collections. And one of the collections that they acquired before the pandemic were the archives of David Small and Sarah Stewart.
So what you see around here is a small portion of the collection that is going to be on display. They have certain hours that this room is available. They have that information on Prism and on their website as far as when you can come up and see these. I might also add that there's also material at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts, at the Kalamazoo Book Center, and if you do make it up to Western's campus, the Richmond Center, which is across from Miller Auditorium, they did an exhibit on Sarah Stewart's gardening journals, and that's one of the focuses there. So anyway, and we had a week ago, I was there, I was at the Zang, and we had a program, Sarah Stewart gave a program. So that's what this is all about. So if you don't see too much of it tonight, I hope you'll come back and look at it. So that's what this is all about. As far as the Zang goes, for those of you that have come to see us, starting September 1st, we were open our regular hours. So we are open Tuesday through Friday from 8 to 5. And Saturday, we're open from 9 to 4. For a year, we spent being closed, but people can make appointments. So we're really happy that we are opened up now, so you can come and visit us if you've never been to the Zang. And as far as any other programs that I'm going to give, I would say stay tuned. I think one of the mistakes I made with the Gazelle Walks in 2020, which may have doomed me, is I had the whole walk series planned in March, which never happens to me. And I had it planned, and then, of course, we know what happened. Hopefully, I'll be able to, as I said, bring that back up in 2022. So I'm hoping for that. So anyway, thank you very much for attending this evening. Ryan, thank you for having KPL host. And I hope you have a good rest of the evening, and I hope, again, to see you once more. Thank you very much.